Okay, so for this lecture, we're going to look at exercise and acid-base balance. And if you recall from what we talked about previously, acids and bases, they are distinguished by their ability to either release or combine with hydrogen ions. And that there's a scale that measures this, a pH scale. I mentioned how it's not necessarily intuitive how the pH scale is laid out, but it's the power of hydrogen ion concentration, and it's an inverse exponential scale. And we talked about how neutral on this pH scale is 7. Anything above that's a base. Anything below that is an acid. And one of the acids we talked about, a key one, is lactic acid. And lactic acid, as we've talked about previously with metabolism, is produced during exercise. So I want to begin to look at the exercise part of this, because it's easy to think, well, yeah, lactic acid, it's bad. We produce it during exercise, that's bad. But one of the misnomers is that that's really the issue that would cause acidosis during exercise. And honestly, it is far from it. Lactic acid is only one of many different acids that we potentially produce during exercise that will alter hydrogen ion concentration. And even this list on here is not an exhaustive list. We have carbonic acid, which if you recall from the Krebs cycle, it's a byproduct of the Krebs cycle. When we utilize fats, which many of us do during low and medium intensity exercise, we use mostly fats actually, mostly fatty acids. The breakdown of those produces ketone bodies, which are acids. When we utilize some amino acid, there's a couple of amino acids that contain sulfur. The breakdown of those produces sulfuric acid. Nucleic acid, phosphoproteins, when those are hydrolyzed, the breakdown of those is phosphoric acid. So there are a lot of acids, whether it's because of the formation of ATP, whether it's because other reactions or mechanisms occurring in exercise, are going to make an attempt to lower pH. As we mentioned in the last lecture, one of the byproducts of this, talked about CO2 and how CO2, we obviously expire CO2, but one of the things we do with hydrogen ions is we can convert them to CO2. And that's where I want to start with this reaction down here. Now, this is not exercise biochemistry, as cool of a class as that would be. So we're not going to get into all the mechanisms here and formulas and moles and things like that. We're just going to try to keep this somewhat basic. And with the idea that if we are producing hydrogen ions, our hope to deal with those is through bicarbonate, to break those down to form CO2 and then water. And this reaction goes both ways as well. It's a reversible reaction. And so the mechanism that we can deal with these hydrogen ions is ultimately to form CO2. And so, not surprising, during exercise, we form a lot of CO2, which we expire. Now, we breathe in as well because we need oxygen, but breathing actually is as much about getting rid of CO2 as it is getting in oxygen. In fact, when we talk about the respiratory system, you'll learn, spoiler alert, actually breathing is really driven by the CO2, oddly enough. In fact, you breathe much more to get rid of CO2 than you do to inhale oxygen. We'll get to that in the coming weeks. So let's kind of look at what's going on with dealing with these acids, because the hope is that we would buffer these. And this term buffer is simply a term of balancing or utilizing these hydrogen ions, buffering their effect to keep pH normal. And the good thing is that humans, because we do produce acids, we also have natural buffers we have to keep pH normal. So, for example, I'm going to start with extracellular first, because it's just a little bit easier. One of the most prominent buffer we have in our body is bicarbonate, H2CO3. Bicarbonate, you've probably heard of sodium bicarbonate, which is in baking soda. This is a very common, very high in concentration buffer that we have in the blood and in other areas of the body. Helps to buffer hydrogen ion concentration. A lot of proteins, both in and out of cells, act as buffers. They tend to have more of a base to them, and they will deal with some of these hydrogen ions. Phosphate groups, which naturally are bases. other proteins in the cell as well. So there are buffers in place to keep pH normal when there are acids being produced to cause pH to drop. And these acid-base buffer systems are key to cellular function. I mean, just imagine if we were not able to control these hydrogen ions. Enzymes couldn't function properly. We couldn't form ATP properly. Muscle, which is made of many proteins, actin, myosin, troponin, tropomyosin, all those would degenerate. I mean, not controlling this is an unbelievable issue. And so we have these buffers in place to keep pH normal. Now, the reality is, though, is that we exercise. We engage in heavy exercise, and as you see, exercise produces lactic acid and other acids. Those are going to decrease pH. That's going to cause a problem with degenerating proteins, ceasing enzymes to work, affecting other mechanisms. So not surprisingly, if we increase hydrogen ion concentration, if we decrease pH, we will impair performance, period. It's probably not a shock to anybody. Even if you've never understood the chemistry, you probably know, oh, I'm working hard, the lactic acid, it's burning. By the way, you're not really on fire. It's just it's a feeling you have that goes your central nervous system. You're not burning. But we get that, yeah, lactic acids are impairing performance to some degree. Now, during exercise, what's happening is, because of the need for more ATP, because the increase of glycolysis is exponential, the byproduct of that, if we're not producing adequate pyruvic acid, is going to be lactic acid. And we are going to see a drop in pH. We'll see a drop in pH in the blood. We will see a greater drop in the muscle. And it kind of makes sense why. Where is ATP being formed? Well, being formed in the muscle, being formed likely in the mitochondria. So, not surprisingly, we'll see a greater drop in muscle pH than we will in the blood. But that will still make its way to the blood. The pH in the blood will drop as well. And obviously, there are factors that are going to affect this. The intensity of activity, in other words, the rate that glycolysis has to increase in order to deal with this activity, in order to meet the ATP demand. How much tissue is involved? Just from a simple mass perspective, the more muscle you have, the more muscle cells you have, the more ability you have to form ATP. Thus, in theory, the more lactic acid you could produce, thus the more you can drop pH. Now, that doesn't mean the more muscle you have, oh, that's bad for you, you're going to have more lactic acid, you're more out of shape. That doesn't mean any of that. It just means you have more cells, you have more ability, more mitochondria to form ATP and potentially to form lactic acid. It's not a bad thing, it's just the nature of having a lot of muscle mass, a lot of muscle cells. And so not surprisingly, we will see the rates of pH drop both in the muscle and the blood, not just with intensity of exercise, but also potentially with duration of exercise as well. And again, we've all experienced this, my guess is to some degree. But we have bicarbonate, and this is one of the key take-homes here as far as exercise goes, is that we have a means to buffer this. And this actually goes back to what we talked about with respiratory and metabolic acidosis alkalosis. That we basically have two means to buffer these hydrogen ions. And basically, the best way to say it is we either breathe them out or we pee them out. I don't know, it's not very nice to say, but we either breathe those out in the form of CO2, or we urinate those out in the form of urine and hydrogen ions being cleared. Now, not surprisingly, if I ask you which of those works better during exercise, think about that for a second. Which works better? Well, what are you more likely to do during exercise? Breathe or excrete urine? Well, breathe, yes. And I know you could excrete urine, but it's not beneficial for a lot of reasons. And so not surprisingly, respiratory responses, respiratory means of getting rid of these hydrogen ions as CO2 is our best mechanism to keep pH normal. Now, does it work perfect? No. Because obviously, we can breathe as heavy as we want and we still can see drops in pH. Not a perfect system, but it is our main mechanism to buffer pH during activity. Now you may be thinking, you may be looking at this being like, okay, I get what you're saying. Breathing, sure. Urinate, already. I can't urinate all the time. That's probably not a good thing, right? Breathing, I can breathe, but you just said, breathing, it works, but it's not perfect either. I mean, there's got to be some other way, Dr. Mitchell, right? There's got to be like a thing. Is there a thing I can take to fix this? Well, I'd love to tell you that there's an easy answer to that. The easy answer is not really. But if you understand what's going on here, you understand that we need bases to counteract these hydrogen ions, to take these hydrogen ions. And that the most common one we have in at least extracellular is bicarbonate. And if you picked up on something I said in the beginning, that bicarbonate you've probably heard of before as sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda, you may begin to put things together and say, well, wait a second. Well, what if I could get a more bicarbonate? What if I had more bicarbonate in my system? If I had more bicarbonate, then I would have more ability to use these hydrogen ions. If I could do that, my pH would stay normal. If I could do that, all the enzymes would be happy, right? PFK would be good. Glycolysis would happen. I'd form ATP. I wouldn't fatigue. That would be a good thing, right? So why don't I just ingest a whole bunch of bicarbonate? Actually, not a horrible idea. And it's actually been done. And the story I tell my classes, I've done this before. I'm not proud of it. Well, not really proud of it. But baking soda is commercially available. It's not a banned substance. And in theory, you could ingest that and, in theory, increase bicarbonate stores. Now, there's one big obvious caveat to this that should make sense. Why wouldn't this work? And think about it. If you take bicarbonate, which has a pH of, sodium bicarbonate's got a pH of like 9 or so, why might that not be as effective as you might think it is? Well, the reason being is when you ingest that, well, where does it go? It goes down our esophagus, goes to the stomach. Well, wait, what's the pH in the stomach? Well, the pH in the stomach is like 3. Well, if you take bicarbonate and an acid, the reaction is going to happen right there. So by the time that bicarbonate gets to the blood, it's already buffered hydrogen ions in the stomach. So the pH in your stomach is a little higher. Great, although that doesn't do wonders for digestion. But this doesn't really have an effect a lot on the blood. Now, having said that, there is research on this. You can research bicarbonate and exercise. I know people that have done it. I'm not saying to do it. I'm not saying it works. I've done it. I put sodium bicarbonate on pizza and ate it years ago. Not pretty, by the way. You eat it, it looks like you're foaming at the mouth with all the white. It's not a good look. But the physiology behind it does have some potential practicality, although there are obviously issues in how that would work in real life. So I want you to grasp that yeah, there is a way here that we could potentially improve performance. And in theory, that's a lot of what we talk about in this class, isn't it? To understand the physiology, and then, okay, can we fix it? When it comes to forming ATP. Okay, great, we know how it works, we know the problem. Well, can we produce more? Is there something we can do? And we talked about, eating a lot of carbohydrate, carbo loading, things like that. We talked about skeletal muscle. We're going to talk about the need for protein synthesis and amino acids. Well, not surprisingly, there's very important things there. When we talked about during metabolism, NADH and FADH, well, we talked about a key part of those are B vitamins, niacin and riboflavin. Well, sure, if you could increase those stores, in theory, you could increase your stores of those B vitamins, increase your store of NADH and FADH, and all of those are key in forming ATP in the mitochondria. So sure, in each of these, we're always looking ways to improve performance. And I'm not saying bicarbonate's one of those ways, but there's research out there. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It's some pretty interesting stuff. We're going to stop acid-base balance here, and we'll go on to the next lecture.